Mom laughed loudly at her wedding reception and said, "This useless one doesn't matter. But thanks to my wonderful younger daughter, I can be happy." My sister smirked, "You're lucky you were even invited." I glanced at my seat and saw the place card. It said unwanted trash. But Mom didn't know I had Dad's final will. The moment it was read aloud, her face turned pale. Elizabeth Collins sat on her morning commuter train, staring at the wedding invitation in her hands. It had arrived just a few days ago, an extravagant piece printed on lavender-colored luxury paper with gold foil, announcing the marriage of Margaret Collins and Robert Williams. It was her mother's second marriage. Elizabeth looked out the window at the passing scenery, immersed in memories of her father, William. 1 year ago, he had suddenly passed away from a heart attack, and the only person who truly understood her was gone from her life. Her father had been a successful businessman who ran a real estate company, but at home, he was always gentle, showing unconditional love especially to Elizabeth. "Elizabeth, you've always been my special child." Her father's words echoed in her ears. William, whose office was on the upper floor of an office building, would sometimes take Elizabeth there and, pointing to the cityscape visible through the window, would say, "Someday, all of this will be yours." At the time, Elizabeth didn't fully understand what he meant, but she knew that only her father recognized her true worth. The next station is Union Square. The train announcement brought Elizabeth back to reality. She took a small mirror from her bag and checked her appearance. There was always a trace of loneliness deep in her eyes. Elizabeth worked as a project manager at an IT company, where she was highly regarded. She oversaw complex system development projects and had earned the trust of clients. But within her family, she had always been the daughter who couldn't meet expectations. Her relationship with her mother Margaret was particularly cold. Margaret was a well-known figure in social circles, the epitome of perfectionism. Always dressed in the latest fashion, her behavior carried the distinctive refinement of the upper class. But contrary to her glamorous appearance, her attitude toward Elizabeth was nothing short of callous. "You always disappoint me. Why can't you be more like Vanessa? You need to improve yourself, Elizabeth." In Elizabeth's memory, her mother's critical words surfaced one after another and then faded away. Her younger sister Vanessa, on the other hand, was Margaret's favorite. Vanessa had model-like looks and a sociable personality, and she excelled in her studies at university. Always the center of attention, when Elizabeth was being criticized by their mother, Vanessa would subtly agree and sometimes even add hurtful remarks with a touch of sarcasm. "Big sister, you're really clumsy. I can't believe you can't even do this properly. Even I think your clothes are too dowdy, sis. If you just tried harder, Mom would surely acknowledge you." The train glided into the station. Elizabeth took a deep breath and stood up. For a moment, her reflection in the window glass seemed to overlap with her father's image. Just before his death, William had confided only in Elizabeth. He told her about Margaret's affair and about a secret will. "I've turned a blind eye to how your mother and sister have treated you for a long time. Forgive me, Elizabeth. But this time, I'll protect you. This is my final gift to you." With those words, he handed Elizabeth a copy of the will he had entrusted to his lawyer. The very next day, he passed away forever. Elizabeth had carefully preserved that will. Walking toward the office building, Elizabeth thought about her mother's upcoming wedding that weekend. She had mixed feelings about this marriage taking place just 1 year after her father's death. Robert was an old friend of her father's, and Elizabeth had vaguely sensed that there was a special relationship between him and Margaret even while her father was alive. Her father knew too, and probably accepted it, fearing the collapse of their family. Her smartphone vibrated. It was a message from her mother. "I'm busy with wedding preparations. You can just come for the latter half of the ceremony. You don't need to be in the photos." Elizabeth sighed. The invitation had arrived just a week before the wedding. And now this message about attending just the latter half. There couldn't be a clearer indication that she wasn't being treated as a family member. Elizabeth put her smartphone back in her bag and pushed open the glass doors of her office building. Immersing herself in work would at least temporarily allow her to forget about her family. As a project manager at an IT company, she supervised multiple teams and negotiated with important clients. In her workplace, she was a confident and capable woman, seemingly a different person from the one who shrank in front of her family. As she sat at her desk, Elizabeth looked at her father's photo. "This time, I'll live up to your expectations," she whispered in her heart. The banquet hall at the luxurious Grand Plaza Hotel in Manhattan was filled with the scent of roses and the elegant melodies of a piano. The venue, decorated with pure white tablecloths and champagne gold ribbons, was perfectly staged like a scene from a movie. Through the windows, the shimmering surface of the Hudson River was visible, with the soft light of dusk gently illuminating the room. Elizabeth paused at the entrance to the venue. It was 4 p.m. As per her mother's message, she was joining from the latter half of the ceremony. The wedding ceremony itself had already ended, and the reception had begun. She took a deep breath and smoothed out the wrinkles of her simple navy dress. She hadn't felt like buying a new dress for this special occasion. She didn't want to attract the attention of other guests today. She just wanted to attend quietly and then be done with it. "May I have your name, please?" the receptionist asked politely. "Elizabeth Collins." The woman scanned the list and briefly frowned. "Ms. Collins, your seat is right here." Elizabeth was shown a seating chart. Her seat was at the edge, near the kitchen door. She nodded slightly and quietly entered the venue. Guests in glamorous dresses were chatting with champagne glasses in hand. Parting the sea of people, Elizabeth made her way to her seat. Along the way, she exchanged smiles with familiar faces. They were old friends of her father's, but Elizabeth pretended not to notice the look of sympathy in their eyes. At the main table sat Margaret in a white wedding dress and Robert in a tuxedo. Margaret looked surprisingly youthful for her 58 years, smiling beautifully. Beside her was Vanessa in a champagne pink dress. The three of them painted a picture of a perfect family. Watching the scene from afar sent a pang through Elizabeth's chest. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us." Margaret's voice resounded through the hall over the microphone. Elizabeth reached her seat and quietly sat down. The table was filled with unfamiliar guests who gave her a slight nod before returning to their conversations. "I am deeply grateful to all of you for celebrating the new journey that Robert and I are embarking on today." Margaret's speech continued. After a brief tribute to the late William, she began to speak about her expectations for her new life. Elizabeth took a sip of water and listened quietly. "And now, I would like to express my gratitude to my dear family who supported me in reaching this wonderful day." Margaret smiled at her sister Vanessa. "My beloved daughter Vanessa, without you, this day would not have been possible. It was you who introduced me to Robert. It was you who warmly watched over and encouraged our relationship." Warm applause rose from the venue. Vanessa stood up and embraced Margaret, and Margaret paused for a moment. "I do have another daughter, don't I?" The atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. Elizabeth held her breath. "This useless one doesn't matter, but I'm happy thanks to my brilliant younger daughter," Margaret said with a laugh. Some guests laughed awkwardly, while others averted their gaze. But no one raised an objection. "She shouldn't even have been invited, right?" Vanessa added with a sneer. There was a hint of sarcasm in her voice, but like Margaret, it was taken as a joke. Elizabeth felt something hot running down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away and tried to maintain a smile. The people at her table gave her sympathetic looks but quickly looked away. Margaret's speech continued and eventually led to a toast. Champagne glasses were raised, and words of congratulations flew around. Elizabeth mechanically raised her glass, but no one tried to meet her eyes. As the speech ended, music began to flow again, and guests started to enjoy their meals and conversation. Elizabeth exhaled deeply and returned to her seat. She picked up the name card placed at her seat, and it read not Elizabeth Collins, but useless trash. Her hand trembled. This must have been a malicious joke from her mother and sister. She quickly tucked the name card into her bag, but the damage had already been done. Something hot welled up in her throat. She took a sip of water, trying to regain her composure. Rising from the edge of the table, Elizabeth headed for the restroom. Standing in front of the mirror, she looked at her own face. There were no tears in her eyes. She had even graduated from crying. She took out a small envelope from her bag. It was a copy of her father William's will. She read it over once more and checked the time. "Soon," she whispered softly. As planned, Jonathan Fisher, the executor of the will, should appear at exactly 7 o'clock. She took another deep breath and left the restroom. When she returned to the venue, desserts were being served, and guests were enjoying sweet cake and coffee. Margaret and Robert were making the rounds of each table, exchanging words with the guests. They approached Elizabeth's table as well. "Well, Elizabeth, you made it." Margaret's voice carried a false warmth. "I prepared a special seat for you. Did you like it?" Vanessa giggled behind her. Elizabeth smiled calmly. "Yes, it was a very special seat. And an appropriate name card." Margaret's eyes glinted coldly. "You still can't take a joke, can you?" At that moment, the entrance to the venue opened, and an elderly man in a gray suit appeared. It was Jonathan Fisher. He surveyed the room and said something to the host. The host looked momentarily confused but took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a special announcement. Mr. Jonathan Fisher, the lawyer for the late William Collins, has some important news to share." The room fell silent. The color drained from Margaret's face. "What?" Her voice trembled. "What business does William's lawyer have here? We've already completed the division of the inheritance." Jonathan slowly stepped forward. "Mrs. Margaret Collins, I apologize for intruding on your celebration. However, as the official executor of William Collins' will, I need to read an important will here today." He opened a black leather binder. Margaret and Vanessa stood frozen. Elizabeth slowly stood up and quietly walked closer to Jonathan. This is the final will of the late William Collins, bearing his handwritten signature and certification by a notary public. Jonathan began to read slowly. For years, I have turned a blind eye to the abuse of my eldest daughter by my wife and younger daughter. To atone for this sin, all my assets are transferred to my eldest daughter, Elizabeth Collins. The diary and recordings I have kept as evidence of my wife's infidelity are being held by my lawyer. At that moment, the venue was enveloped in silence. Margaret's face turned pale, and she grabbed Robert's arm for support. Vanessa covered her mouth with her hand, a look of shock on her face. This must be some mistake. Margaret's scream echoed through the venue. She walked toward Jonathan, pointing at the will with trembling fingers. This document is a forgery. We have already completed the official division of the inheritance. Jonathan responded calmly. Mrs. Margaret, this is an official will created by Mr. William 2 weeks before his death. It has notary certification and signatures from multiple witnesses. Legally, this is the latest and valid will. That's absurd. Margaret was at a loss for words. Robert placed his hand on Margaret's shoulder, but there was doubt in his eyes. Margaret, what is this about? The venue erupted into commotion. Guests started whispering to each other, and some began to leave their seats. Vanessa rushed to her mother's side and supported her. Infidelity? What evidence do you have? Vanessa raised her voice. Jonathan took out another document from the binder. Mr. William meticulously recorded his findings, dates, locations, and even photographs and recordings as evidence. He took out a piece of paper and began to read. February 15, 2023, Margaret and Robert met in a suite at the Plaza Hotel. They stayed from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Stop. Margaret's face had turned red. Robert took a step away from her. Is this true? Even while William was alive? Margaret tried to make excuses, but Jonathan pulled out a small recorder from his pocket. Mr. William also left this in case the will was contested. The voices flowing from the recorder were unmistakably those of Margaret and Robert. It was a conversation about their secret meeting. And surprisingly, there was also a part where Margaret discussed William's health condition, saying, "He doesn't have long." When the recording ended, the venue fell into a deafening silence. The color drained from Robert's face. He looked at Margaret and said in a trembling voice, "You told me that your relationship with William had already grown cold. You said it was a natural progression for us to become close after his death." Margaret desperately grabbed Robert's arm. "Robert, I love you. That much is true." But Robert shook off her hand. "I believed in you," he whispered softly and slowly began to head toward the exit. At this point, Elizabeth quietly stepped forward. Her demeanor was strangely calm. "Father knew everything. How you treated me, your relationship with Robert." Elizabeth's voice was soft, but it resonated throughout the venue. "Father silently accepted it, fearing the collapse of our family. But in the end, he chose truth and justice." Margaret glared at Elizabeth with an expression that mixed intense anger and fear. "You incited your father, didn't you? You ungrateful." "That's enough, Mrs. Margaret," Jonathan interrupted sternly. "I would ask you to refrain from accusations in a setting like this." Vanessa stood beside her mother, looking at Elizabeth with cold eyes. "Sis, what do you want? Are you satisfied with ruining us?" Elizabeth quietly shook her head. "I only fulfilled my father's last wish. What you think of as family bonds never existed in the first place." Robert looked back at Margaret one last time, gazing at her with sad eyes. "I believed in you," he said again, and then left the venue. The wedding host stood perplexed, unsure how to proceed with the remaining agenda, such as the cake cutting and dancing. Guests began to leave one after another. Some of Margaret's longtime friends approached her, trying to offer words of comfort, but she seemed beyond hearing anyone's words. "Everyone, if you're leaving, please take your party favors with you," the host said, trying to lighten the atmosphere, but to no effect. Elizabeth stood next to Jonathan and spoke to him in a low voice. "What happens now?" Jonathan answered quietly, "We'll start the formal property transfer procedures tomorrow. You will inherit Mr. Williams' real estate company and all his assets." Elizabeth nodded slightly. About 20 minutes later, the venue was almost empty. Only Margaret, Vanessa, and a few of Margaret's close friends remained. Margaret suddenly walked toward Elizabeth. Her eyes were red and swollen with tears, but her expression was filled with anger. "What good will this do?" she said in a low voice. "You're just using your father's death for revenge." Elizabeth responded calmly, "I'm just fulfilling my father's last wish. On this day when you called me useless trash and didn't even want to invite me." Margaret was momentarily speechless. She knew about the name card. "That was a joke. You never understand jokes." "You can consider everything that happened today a joke," Elizabeth replied. "Let's meet at the law office tomorrow to discuss what happens next." Margaret was about to say something more, but Vanessa pulled her arm. "Mom, let's go home. Nothing will change by staying here." The two of them gave Elizabeth one last cold look and left the venue. Elizabeth remained standing in the empty venue with Jonathan. "Are you all right, Elizabeth?" Jonathan asked gently. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Yes, my father's wish has been fulfilled. Now it's up to me to take over properly." She looked around the venue. The once elaborately decorated space was now enveloped in an odd quietness. Half-eaten cakes and half-drunk champagne glasses were left abandoned on the tables. What will happen to their new home? Elizabeth suddenly thought to ask. Since the property is in Mr. Williams' name, it will all be yours. Mrs. Margaret and Miss Vanessa will have to stay at a hotel from tomorrow. Elizabeth quietly nodded. "I see." She returned to her seat and took out the name card that read useless trash from her bag. She looked at it for a long time, then gently tucked it into her pocket. "Are you leaving?" Jonathan asked. "Yes, that's enough," Elizabeth replied. "I need to prepare for a new beginning." She quietly left the venue. Outside was cloaked in darkness, but the stars were shining brightly. Elizabeth looked up at the sky. "Did you see, Father?" she whispered softly. "As you wished, I've become strong." A week passed. Elizabeth sat in the president's office of William Collins Real Estate, looking out the window. It was her first weekend since taking over her father's company. Piles of documents sat on her desk, and her father's picture hung on the wall. "I wish I could have been of more help to you sooner," she said to the photograph. The door was knocked, and Jonathan peeked in. "May I come in?" "Please do." Elizabeth looked up from her documents. Jonathan slowly approached and sat down in the chair in front of the desk. "We've received a message from Mrs. Margaret and Ms. Vanessa. They would like to meet with you today to discuss some matters." Elizabeth frowned. "About what?" "About living expenses. Hotel living seems to be financially difficult for them. They're asking for funds to rent an apartment and cover their immediate living expenses." Elizabeth let out a deep sigh. After the wedding, Margaret and Vanessa had been evicted from their luxurious penthouse and were forced to live in a hotel. With the marriage to Robert called off and losing their economic support, they could no longer maintain their luxurious lifestyle. "What time?" 3 in the afternoon. "They suggest meeting at our office." Elizabeth nodded slightly. "Understood. I'll be there." After Jonathan left the room, Elizabeth turned her chair to look out the window. The skyscrapers of New York gleamed in the morning light. A week ago at this time, she was still working as a project manager at the IT company. Now she was the president of her father's company. She had never imagined her life could change so rapidly. At 3 p.m., Elizabeth arrived at Jonathan's law office. When she was shown into the conference room, Margaret and Vanessa were already seated. The two looked completely different from a week ago. Margaret's face showed deep fatigue, and Vanessa had lost her usual radiance. Both were dressed simply, with minimal makeup. "Elizabeth," Margaret called out in a small voice. Her voice lacked its former dignity. Elizabeth quietly took a seat. "How are you?" Margaret didn't answer, and Vanessa spoke instead. "To be honest, we're in terrible shape. We have nothing left." "You took everything," Margaret added. Her voice was tinged with anger and resentment. Elizabeth responded calmly, "I didn't take anything. It was Father's will." "You manipulated Father." Margaret raised her voice. "William would never do this to us." Jonathan quietly intervened. "Mrs. Margaret, I'd like you to avoid becoming emotional. Today is purely about discussing living expenses." Margaret bit her lip, suppressing her anger. Vanessa sighed and took out some documents. "This is the minimum we need for living expenses." Elizabeth looked over the documents. It was quite a substantial amount. She circled some figures with her pen and glanced at Jonathan. "Considering Father's intentions, I cannot give you such an amount unconditionally," Elizabeth said quietly. "Then what are we supposed to do?" Vanessa's voice trembled. "Should we become homeless?" Elizabeth shook her head. "That's not what I mean. I just want to set some conditions." "Conditions?" Margaret frowned. "Yes. I need time to think. For today, I'll give you half this amount as living expenses for 1 month. For what comes after, please give me a little more time." Margaret and Vanessa exchanged looks. They had no choice. "Fine," Margaret reluctantly agreed. "Let's meet again in a month." After the meeting ended and Margaret and Vanessa left the room, Elizabeth turned to Jonathan. "I'd like to look at Father's study. Has it been touched yet?" "No. As per Mr. Williams' instructions, it's been left untouched until you could see it. I'd like to go there tomorrow." The next day, Elizabeth visited her father's luxurious mansion. It was the house where Margaret and Vanessa had lived. Now no one lived there. The grand entrance hall still retained the splendor from before the wedding. Elizabeth quietly climbed the stairs and headed for the study on the second floor. It was where her father had spent most of his time. As she entered the room, she was enveloped in the familiar scent of wood and leather. A wall of bookshelves, a heavy wooden desk, and a large leather chair by the window. Her father often sat in that chair, gazing out the window. She approached the desk and began opening drawers. Several notebooks and piles of documents appeared. And in the last drawer, she found a small wooden box that was locked. This is Elizabeth took out a small key from her bag that her father had given her while he was still alive. It fit perfectly. Opening the box, she found several leather-bound diaries. There was a post-it note attached to the top diary. To Elizabeth, written in her father's handwriting. She took the diary and sat down in the chair by the window. As she opened the diary, she found words that could be described as her father's cry of the soul. For years, I have silently known of my wife's infidelity. It was out of fear of our family falling apart. But that's just an excuse. I lacked the courage to confront my wife directly. And above all, I couldn't protect Elizabeth. With each page she turned, her father's anguish and regret continued. Details of Margaret's infidelity, records of how she and Vanessa had treated Elizabeth, and her father's own feelings of helplessness and guilt. And on the last page, there was a section titled Final Message to Margaret. Margaret, I loved you, but you were cold to our daughter and betrayed me as well. After I leave this world, you will probably marry Robert. That's when the truth will be revealed. Elizabeth has always been the special one in my heart. Elizabeth wiped away tears as she closed the diary. Looking out the window, she saw the gentle light of dusk filtering into the garden. Several weeks later, Elizabeth had begun fully operating her father's company. At first, William's longtime employees showed hesitation toward their young female president, but they were quickly impressed by her sincerity and decisiveness. James, who had been her father's right-hand man, supported her completely and taught her the details of the business. William always believed that you would take over the company one day, James told Elizabeth one day. He often said, "My daughter is special." Meanwhile, Margaret and Vanessa had rented a small apartment and begun a modest life. Particularly Margaret was struggling to adapt to the stark contrast from her once luxurious lifestyle. Vanessa had found a job as an assistant at a beauty salon, but Margaret had yet to find work. Elizabeth continued to send them living expenses once a month, but there was no conversation, and after a month had passed, it was time to meet again. This time, Elizabeth invited the two to a restaurant. It wasn't high-end, but it had a relaxed atmosphere. "What do you want today?" Margaret's attitude was still cold. Elizabeth took out her father's diary and placed it on the table. "I've read this. It contains father's true feelings." Margaret and Vanessa looked at the diary warily. "I've been thinking, rather than completely cutting ties, I'd like to continue providing support, but with conditions." "Conditions?" Vanessa asked. "Acknowledge how you've treated me in the past and sincerely apologize. And regret having betrayed father." Margaret was speechless. Vanessa lowered her eyes. For the first time, a hint of remorse appeared on their faces. A year later, on a winter Sunday, Elizabeth stood at William Collins' grave. In her hand was a bouquet of white roses. Snow quietly piled on the tombstone, gently covering her father's name. "Father, it's been a year now," she spoke gently. "Your company is doing well. Last month, our new expansion to the south was successful." She placed the roses in front of the tombstone and brushed away the snow. "As you wished, I've become strong." William Collins' real estate was steadily growing under her leadership. Her father's employees recognized her leadership, and new initiatives were succeeding. Elizabeth was now a respected figure in the industry. Her relationship with Margaret and Vanessa was also gradually changing. The first few months were tense, but over time, especially Vanessa began to acknowledge her mistakes. Margaret had not yet fully opened her heart, but she had started to express words of gratitude when receiving their monthly living expenses. The two had gradually adapted to their modest apartment life and were building a new daily routine. Margaret had started working as a cashier at a local supermarket, and Vanessa was slowly building her career at the beauty salon. Their lives had drastically changed, but it was the result of their own actions. Especially for Margaret, the events at the wedding had spread on social media, significantly damaging her reputation in the local community. Many of her former friends had distanced themselves, and invitations to luxurious parties had ceased. Still, once a month, Elizabeth had dinner with them, gradually building conversation. True apology and remorse were not yet complete, but at least on the surface, they were moving toward reconciliation. Robert had moved to California and started a new life. He sent a letter to Elizabeth, saying that as William's friend, he was happy about her success. Elizabeth's own life had changed too. She had met David, a businessman in the IT industry, and was nurturing a quiet romantic relationship. Like her father, he respected Elizabeth and loved her strength. "Father, I'll bring David to meet you next time. I'm sure you would have liked him." Elizabeth placed her hand on the tombstone and whispered her final words. "Thank you, Father. Your legacy lives on in me." She quietly stood up and left the snow-covered cemetery. In the car, David was waiting for her. "All done?" he asked gently. "Yes," Elizabeth smiled. "Let's go to the restaurant now. Mom and my sister are coming today too." The car started moving, proceeding through the snowy landscape. Looking out the window, Elizabeth reflected on the changes her father's final gift had brought her. It wasn't revenge, but liberation in the name of truth. She had finally begun to walk her own life, by her own will.